You know what's the cruelest thing you can do to a car company? Build an engine so technically advanced it wins awards, so powerful it redefines performance, so innovative it makes the Germans nervous, and then have it grenade itself at 60,000 miles. Every single time, without fail, like clockwork. I'm talking about the Northstar V8, Cadillac's moonshot engine that was supposed to save the brand and instead nearly destroyed it. Never heard of it? What if I told you this aluminum masterpiece made 300 horsepower in 1993 when BMW's V8 made 282? What if I told you it could run 50 miles without coolant? What if I told you it also had a 100% failure rate if you kept it long enough? The North Star has always fascinated me. I'm not entirely sure why, to be honest. Maybe because it's the perfect example of hubris meeting reality at 7,000 at RPM. Maybe because it represents everything wrong with GM's approach to engineering, brilliant innovation coupled with catastrophic execution. Or maybe because underneath all those blown head gaskets and stripped threads was genuinely one of the most advanced engines America ever built. Dual overhead cams, 4 valves per cylinder, aluminum everything. In 1993, when Ford was still pushing push rods and Chrysler was, well, being Chrysler. So with that out of the way, let's rewind to the late 1980s. Cadillac is dying. And I don't mean struggling, I mean actually dying. Sales have dropped from 390,000 in 1978 to 213,000 in 1991. The average Cadillac buyer is 65 years old and getting older. Mercedes and BMW are eating their lunch, dinner, and breakfast. Lexus just showed up with the LS400 and made every Cadillac look like it was built in a barn. The Cadillac V8 6.4, their previous attempt at innovation, had failed so spectacularly that customers were paying dealers to permanently disable the cylinder deactivation. The HT4100 that replaced it was somehow worse, an engine so weak and unreliable that Cadillac owners were retrofitting Oldsmobile engines into their cars. Let that sink in. Cadillac owners were downgrading to Oldsmobile engines for reliability. Enter John Grettenberger, Cadillac's general manager, who basically told his engineers, "Build me a world-class engine or we're done." Not competitive with world-class, actually world-class. Better than Mercedes, better than BMW, better than anything coming out of Japan. The budget? Essentially unlimited. This was GM in its final "we're too big to fail" era. Before they discovered that, turns out they weren't. The specifications they laid out were insane for an American V8 in 1987. Dual overhead cams, when even Corvette was still using push rods. 4 valves per cylinder, 32 total. All aluminum construction, block and heads. Variable valve timing, though they couldn't quite figure that out and dropped it. Direct ignition with no distributor. Sequential fuel injection, a red line of 6,700 RPM, later raised to 7,000. These weren't evolutionary improvements. This was revolution. The development team was interesting. Instead of using GM's traditional engine guys, they pulled in engineers from all over. Lotus Engineering consulted on the heads. Oldsmobile's racing division helped with the bottom end. They even brought in people from GM's diesel division, which explains a lot, actually. The project name was L47, which sounds like a vitamin supplement but actually stood for Luxury 4-Cam 7-liter, except it wasn't 7 liters. It was 4.6. GM math, apparently. Now, check this out. The engineering solutions they came up with were genuinely brilliant. The block was aluminum with cast iron cylinder liners, pretty standard now, but revolutionary for American V8s then. The heads were aluminum with powder metal valve seats that could handle unleaded fuel without hardened seats. The cam drive was a chain at the front, not a belt, because Cadillac remembered the disaster of broken timing belts on their earlier attempts. Everything was designed to be smooth, refined, powerful, and reliable. Well, 3 out of 4 isn't bad, right? The party trick, the thing everyone remembers, was the limp home mode. If the engine lost coolant, it would automatically shut off fuel to alternating cylinders, using them as air pumps to cool the others. You could theoretically drive 50 miles without any coolant at all. GM's marketing called it peace of mind. Mechanics called it that thing that never actually works when you need it. But it sounded impressive in the brochure. The power output was genuinely impressive. The first version in 1993 made 295 horsepower and 209 lb-ft of torque from 4.6 liters naturally aspirated. BMW's 4.0-liter V8 made 282 HP. Mercedes 4.2 made 275. The Northstar was outpowering the Germans while matching their displacement efficiency. The later supercharged version made 440 horsepower, which was absolutely bonkers for the mid-1990s. That's more than the Ferrari 360 that came out several years later. The sound was unlike any American V8 before it. Not the lumpy rumble of a pushrod engine, but a smooth, sophisticated wail that climbed to 7,000 RPM like a European exotic. It didn't sound like a Cadillac. It sounded like the future. Journalists were stunned. Motor Trend called it perhaps the most technically advanced production V8 in the world. Car and Driver said it was proof that America could still innovate. Everyone loved it. For about 60,000 miles. Here's where things get interesting. And by interesting, I mean catastrophic. The headbolt threads would pull out of the aluminum block. Just pull right out like they were setting cheese. This wasn't a gasket failure initially. The gaskets were actually pretty good. It was the bolts themselves losing their grip on the block. Once that happened, compression would drop, coolant would mix with oil, oil would mix with coolant, and your $75,000 Cadillac would turn into a very expensive paperweight. The technical reason is fascinating if you're into metallurgy. Aluminum and cast iron have different thermal expansion rates. The iron head bolts and aluminum block would expand and contract at different rates through heat cycles. Over time, this would work the threads loose. GM's solution? Longer bolts. Come on. That's like fixing a broken leg with a longer cast. The underlying problem was still there. But wait, there's more. The oil consumption was biblical. A quart every 1,000 miles was considered normal. A quart every 500 miles was common. Some owners reported adding more oil than gas. The ring design was too light for the high revving nature of the engine. The cylinder bores would go oval over time. The oil would blow past the rings and either burn or leak out. Usually both. Furthermore, the carbon buildup was insane. The direct ignition system meant the spark plugs were deep in wells in the heads. Oil would leak into these wells and cook onto the plugs. The carbon would build up until the engine misfired. Changing spark plugs, a 30-minute job on most engines, took 4 hours and special tools on a Northstar. Some mechanics would just refuse to do it. The cooling system was another nightmare. GM used Dex-Cool, their new lifetime coolant that was supposed to last 150,000 miles. Turns out it would turn to sludge at about 50,000 miles, clogging passages and destroying water pumps. The aluminum in the engine would corrode, leaving deposits throughout the cooling system. The radiators would clog. The heater cores would fail. The engine would overheat. And remember those headbolt threads? Yeah, one overheating event and game over. The timing chain tensioners were hydraulic and would lose pressure over time. The chains would slap, stretch, and eventually jump time. When that happened, valves met pistons in a catastrophic ballet of destruction. Interference engine design meant any timing failure was a complete engine rebuild, if you could even find someone willing to do it. You know what's really tragic? GM knew about these problems early on. Internal documents that came out during various lawsuits showed they were aware of the headbolt issue by 1995, just 2 years after launch. Their solution? Deny warranty claims whenever possible, blame customers for improper maintenance, require detailed service records for any warranty work. Classic GM. The revised version in 2000 was supposed to fix everything. Longer headbolts with coarser threads, revised ring design, better cooling system components, different oil specifications. It helped, but it didn't solve the fundamental problems. The The 2000-2003 engines would last maybe 80,000 miles instead of 60,000. Progress. Sort of. Meanwhile, Cadillac was putting this engine in everything. The Eldorado, Seville, DeVille, DTS, STS, XLR, SRX. Even the Bonneville and Lucerne got versions of it. They were spreading the failure across their entire lineup. Every blown Northstar wasn't just one unhappy customer. It was one customer who would never buy a Cadillac again and would tell everyone they knew to avoid them. The repair costs were astronomical. A head gasket job required pulling the entire engine. The book time was 20 hours. At $150 per hour, that's $3,000 in labor alone. Parts would run another $2,000. And that's if nothing else was damaged. If the block threads were stripped, which they usually were, you'd need thread inserts or a new block. Total cost could easily hit $7,000 on a car worth maybe $10,000. Most people just junk them. Some enterprising mechanics developed fixes. Jake Raby of Raby Enterprises created thread inserts specifically for Northstar blocks. Norms Nordstrom developed a special head stud kit. These fixes worked, but they cost thousands of dollars and required complete engine disassembly. It was like chemotherapy for cars, expensive, painful, and not guaranteed to work. The enthusiastic community developed elaborate workarounds. They'd drill and tap the block for larger bolts. They'd use aviation-grade thread inserts. They'd switch to different coolants and oils. They'd install additional coolant system components. They'd basically re-engineer the engine to work properly. The fact that owners had to fix GM's engineering failures themselves tells you everything. What's particularly frustrating is that when the Northstar worked, it was brilliant. The power delivery was smooth and linear. The refinement was exceptional. It could cruise at 100-mile-hours all day long without breaking a sweat. It made Cadillacs genuinely competitive with European sport sedans in terms of performance. The problem was, it couldn't do it for more than a few years without exploding. The racing versions were actually successful. The Northstar-powered Cadillac LMP cars won at Le Mans. The modified versions in SCCA racing dominated their classes. When properly built with the right components, it was a fantastic engine. But those race engines had steel blocks, forged internals, and proper head studs. They were basically completely different engines that happened to share a name. The cultural impact was devastating. The Northstar became a punchline. Mechanics would joke about Death Star engines. Used car buyers learned to specifically avoid any Cadillac with the Northstar. The resale values cratered. You could buy a 5-year-old STS for less than a comparable Honda Accord because everyone knew the engine was a time bomb. This happened right when Cadillac was trying to reinvent itself. The art and science design language was working. The CTS was attracting younger buyers. The Escalade was becoming a cultural icon. But the Northstar was poisoning everything. How do you convince someone to buy a luxury performance sedan when everyone knows the engine will fail? The opportunity cost was enormous. While GM was pouring money into fixing the unfixable Northstar, Mercedes was developing the M156 6.2-liter V8. BMW was perfecting the N62. Audi was working on the 4.2 FSI. Lexus was refining their bulletproof 1UZ FE. Every dollar spent on Northstar Band-Aids was a dollar not spent on developing something better. GM finally killed the Northstar in 2011, replacing it with the LF series of direct-injected Vulc 6. 18 years of production, hundreds of thousands of failed engines, billions in warranty claims, repairs, and lost customers. It was one of the most expensive engineering disasters in automotive history, and it was completely preventable. You see, the really infuriating part is that GM knew how to build reliable engines. The small block Chevy V8 was legendary for durability. The 3800 V6 would run forever with basic maintenance. The Vortec truck engines were indestructible. They could have just put a refined version of the LS V8 in Cadillacs and called it a day. But no, they had to be clever. They had to innovate. They had to prove they could out-engineer the Germans. The irony is that while Cadillac was failing with their high-tech Northstar, Chrysler was succeeding with ancient technology. The 300c's Hemi V8 was a pushrod design from the Stone Age, but it was reliable and powerful and sounded amazing. Sometimes good enough really is good enough. Sometimes boring reliability beats exciting innovation. What really gets me is how unnecessary it all was. The problems weren't unsolvable. Honda had been building aluminum DOHC engines for years without these issues. Toyota's 1UZ FE was all aluminum, DOHC, 32 valve, and bulletproof. The solutions existed. GM just didn't implement them, either through incompetence, cheapness, or hubris. The Headbolt issue could have been solved with steel thread inserts from the factory. Would have cost maybe $50 per engine. The oil consumption, better rings and bore finishing techniques, maybe $100 per engine. The cooling system problems, don't use experimental coolant and plastic components. Another $100. For $250 per engine, the Northstar could have been reliable. GM chose to save that money and destroyed Cadillac's reputation instead. Modern engineers study the Northstar as a cautionary tale. It's taught in engineering schools as an example of how not to develop an engine, how not to test, how not to respond to problems, how not to treat customers. It's become the textbook example of American automotive hubris, right alongside the Vega, the Pinto, and the Corvair. The survivors are interesting. The few Northstars still running have usually been completely rebuilt with aftermarket fixes. They're like automotive Frankenstein's monsters, kept alive through extraordinary measures. Their owners are either masochists or true believers, sometimes both. They'll tell you about the smooth power, the refinement, the sophistication. They won't mention the $10,000 they've spent keeping it running. Some people are now putting LS engines into Northstar Cadillacs. It's the ultimate admission of failure, taking out the high-tech, sophisticated, European fighting Northstar and replacing it with a low-tech pushrod truck engine. And you know what? The cars are better for it, more powerful, more reliable, more enjoyable. Everything the Northstar should have been, but wasn't. The Northstar damaged Cadillac in ways that are hard to quantify. It wasn't just the warranty costs or the lost sales. It was the breach of trust. Luxury car buyers expect problems with German cars. It's almost part of the experience. But Cadillac was supposed to be the sensible choice, the reliable luxury option. The Northstar destroyed that perception completely. Think about the buyers who got burned. These weren't kids buying used Civics. These were successful people who could afford new Cadillacs. Doctors, lawyers, business owners, people with influence and voices. When their $75,000 Cadillac needed a new engine at 60,000 miles, they told everyone. Country clubs, boardrooms, golf courses. The word spread, don't buy Cadillacs. Cadillac still hasn't fully recovered. Sure, the current cars are excellent. The CT5OV Blackwing is a masterpiece. The Escalade prints money. But talk to luxury car buyers about Cadillac, and eventually someone brings up the Northstar. Remember those engines that always failed? It's been over a decade since the last one was built, and people still remember. The technical legacy is complicated. The Northstar proved American engineers could design sophisticated engines. It pioneered technologies that are now commonplace. The limp home mode influenced modern engine management systems. The construction techniques advanced aluminum engine manufacturing. In a weird way, it pushed the industry forward even while failing. But that's like saying the Titanic advanced maritime safety. True, but wouldn't it have been better if it hadn't sunk? The Northstar's failures taught GM valuable lessons, but those lessons came at an incredible cost. They learned to test more thoroughly, to not ignore problems, to prioritize reliability over specifications. Expensive lessons that competent management would have already known. What's particularly galling is that GM repeated many of these mistakes with other engines. The 3.6 high-feature V6 had timing chain issues. The Ecotec had timing chain issues. The early direct injection engines had carbon buildup issues. It's like they learned nothing from the Northstar disaster. Or they learned but didn't care. I'm not sure which is worse, Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if the Northstar had been reliable. Would Cadillac have successfully competed with the Germans? Would they have attracted younger buyers earlier? Would they have avoided the bankruptcy and bailout? It's impossible to know, but I suspect a reliable Northstar would have changed everything. Cadillac could have been Lexus before Lexus existed. Instead, the Northstar became everything wrong with American automotive engineering, distilled into 279 cubic inches of aluminum disaster. Ambitious but incompetent, sophisticated but unreliable, powerful but fragile. It promised the world and delivered heartbreak. It was supposed to save Cadillac and instead nearly destroyed it. The real tragedy isn't that the Northstar failed. Engines fail. It happens. The tragedy is that GM knew it was failing and kept building it anyway. For 18 years, they kept taking customers' money for cars they knew would fail. They denied warranties they should have honored. They destroyed trust that took decades to build and may never fully return. Modern GM says they've learned from their mistakes. The current engines are generally reliable. The build quality has improved dramatically. But every time they announce some new technology, some revolutionary advancement, I think about the Northstar. I think about those poor bastards who believed GM's promises and got burned. I wonder if this time will be different. The Northstar should have been Cadillac's redemption. It had all the right ingredients: advanced technology, impressive performance, sophisticated engineering. It checked every box except the most important one. It had to actually work. It's like building a gorgeous house on a rotten foundation. Looks great until it collapses. In the end, the Northstar stands as a monument to misplaced priorities. GM prioritized specifications over reliability, complexity over durability, innovation over execution. They built an engine to impress automotive journalists instead of satisfy customers. They won the headline battle and lost the ownership war. And maybe that's the real lesson of the Northstar, that in the car business, boring reliability beats exciting unreliability every single time. That customers remember failures longer than successes. That trust, once broken, is almost impossible to rebuild. That sometimes the best engineering solution is the simple one that actually works. The Northstar didn't quite ruin Cadillac. The brand survived, evolved, and builds excellent cars today. But it came close. Closer than anyone at GM wants to admit. It took a brand that stood for American luxury and made it stand for American failure. It turned Cadillac from an aspiration into a warning. That's the Northstar's true legacy. Not the advanced technology or impressive performance, but the customers who will never buy another Cadillac because of it. And honestly, they're not wrong. Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me for 18 years with the same failed engine design while denying the problem exists? That's unforgivable. The Northstar didn't just fail as an engine. It failed as a promise, as a symbol, as a representation of what American luxury could be. And that's the kind of failure that echoes through generations. So here's to the Northstar V8, the engine that could have been great but wasn't, the technology that impressed everyone except the people who had to live with it, the disaster that taught GM lessons they should have already known, the almost catastrophe that became an actual catastrophe through sheer corporate stubbornness. It deserved better. Cadillac deserved better. The customers absolutely deserved better. But this is GM we're talking about. Better was never really on the table, just different ways of failing spectacularly. And in that regard, the Northstar was a complete success.